I was rereading the Gospel of John, and chapter 8 has some parts that I was inspired to talk about briefly, specifically how they show that the true gospel of the true Messiah, the true King, Yeshua HaMashiach, also known as Jesus Christ, is actually very different from the gospel that you'll get from the mainstream Christian church, the Pauline church. So I'm just going to read a few verses and share my perspective. So John chapter 8, verse 4, we start reading about how people were challenging Yeshua and his adherence to the Mosaic law. Basically, they were trying to make him out to be a bad person in some way. 4 reads, "They say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. Someone like that should be stoned. But what sayest thou? What do you say?" Right? And then he goes on to respond and say, whoever among you is without sin, cast the first stone. And then he then tells the woman, I don't condemn you, so go and sin no more. In modern English, that would be stop sinning, right? So a couple things here clear up a lot of misinformation and confusion with mainstream Christianity. So Pauline Christianity will tell you that the law is done away with, and when they speak of the law, they'll often be talking about the full 600 plus laws that can be found in the Old Testament. And they'll say, well, we don't have to follow all that anymore because the law is completely done away with, and through blood power magic, all your sins are done away with through atonement, even though Jesus never taught that that was the whole purpose of his coming, purpose of his ministry, or the purpose of him accepting the crucifixion. What he did tell us was that the entire law, all the teachings of the prophets, could be summed up, could be condensed to what he called the greatest commandments, which is to love God, others, and ourselves. So this was a refinement of the law. It was a refinement of understanding away from legalism, away from this overly technical understanding of the moral law. And this is an example of that, where he shows mercy towards the woman. He doesn't do something that would be, a very brutal punishment to an extent that would actually be a violation of the law, because it's such a brutal punishment. It's no longer proportional to the offense carried out, so it's not loving, so it's actually a violation of God's law. This also comes up with people challenging him on the Sabbath. And when he said, well, if someone rescued an animal, cared for an animal on the Sabbath, that's obviously not a bad thing, but you're going to make it out to be one. These hypocrites, these people pushing this legalism, right? But that doesn't mean that there's no law at all, right? He was against the legalism, but he was for the true law, which is a law of love. Not that complicated, right? And it's clearly there in his words, but that's not what the church teaches, and that's not what most Christians teach, or that's not what most Christians believe, right? All right, so moving on to verse 29. So still in chapter 8 of John, verse 29. Yeshua said, "And he that sent me is with me. The Father has not left me alone, for I always do those things that please him. And other translations have it more accurate, saying, because I do always those things that please him. So, using some common sense here, you can recognize, well, he's saying, the Father has not left me alone because I always do the things that please him, right? So it's conditional, right? Elsewhere he says that if we don't forgive, we won't be forgiven, right? Conditional. But what does the Church of Paul teach? Unconditional grace, right? Which is a half-truth, just like their stance against legalism is a half-truth, right? Legalism isn't the answer, but that doesn't mean that there isn't any moral law. And likewise, we are offered grace unconditionally, repeatedly, but this grace comes in the form of opportunities. It's not an atoning blood payment, free pass to heaven. So yes, there is free grace, but it's not the form in which they tell you it is. In order to actually please the Father, you have to actually fulfill the opportunities, fulfill the kairos moments, and fulfill the commandments. Yeshua said, to love him is to keep his commandments, right? Obviously, that's going to be pleasing to him if you show him love. Very straightforward, but again, not at all taught by the hijacked Church of Paul, which is really sabotaging the religious life of anyone who takes it up and goes along with it. In verse 37, Yeshua says, that his word has no place in you. He says, because my word had no place in you, right? So, as I'm pointing out here, and I pointed out in other talks, the actual words of Yeshua have no place in these Paulinists because they've replaced the true king with this idol, this false apostle, this anti-Christ figure. Verse 47, Yeshua says, he that is of God hears God's words. Therefore, you don't hear them because you are not of God. If you're following this so-called apostle who bases his legitimacy on this story wherein he has a vision of a being that tells him he's Jesus and then starts quoting the Greek, the pagan god Dionysus, and given this alternative gospel contradictory to that of Yeshua, well, that's the God you're following, right? Who's Dionysus? Son of Zeus? Who's Zeus associated with? Right? So you're in this inverted counterfeit Christianity, and yet you think you're on your way to heaven. It's just not the truth. So I hope this reality check is helpful to some folks. Take care. Sin no more. So that goes against core tenet of the Pauline Church, which is that you can't stop sinning. Right? So just think critically here, independently here. Does it make sense that the Messiah would give a command that you couldn't follow? The church will tell you, oh, it's just to show you, how worthless and pathetic and depraved you are. Really? Is that what Jesus was doing? He was just telling people to sin no more, but he didn't really mean it. He was just giving them direction they couldn't follow. That's quite a huge assumption. And it's actually worse than an assumption because it's slandering Yeshua, right? It's saying that he would tell people to do things, encourage people to do things without any qualification, without any further direction knowing full well that they're going to fail. And the church is going to say, well, he knew that that's what was going to happen, but then they would recognize that they need to, believe in his blood power, the power of his blood shed to pay for their sins. Right? Just one assumption after another. It's just total made-up theology coming from the false apostle Paul. It's not actually originating from the words of Yeshua, right? They're putting words in his mouth. Something very straightforward like telling someone to stop sinning. They can't accept that as it reads, so they have to twist it to fit their nonsense, morally bankrupt theology.